Biden has done pretty well when it comes to domestic policy. Biden's response to the coronavirus has been, after those years of Trump's idiocy and incompetence and blundering when it came to the coronavirus, spreading lies, absurd kinds of solutions, inaction, total incompetence. Uh, Biden has seemed like a breath of fresh air on that front. Biden's relief measures for people suffering, for the economy, were very positive. Biden's infrastructure plan, a massive $2 trillion plan, was on a scale that was reminiscent of the New Deal. It would have been a great program. But Biden has been limited by a couple factors. One is that he has this fantasy about bipartisanship. Mitch McConnell made clear during Obama and now again under Biden that the Republicans have no interest in bipartisanship. He said his agenda is to make sure that Biden is a one-term president, and he's going to do everything he can to undermine Biden's efforts. And so we've seen that happening. The Republicans are not willing to support the infrastructure bill or the other economic and relief measures that are necessary. But Biden is looking for bipartisanship. The other problem is that there are some members of the Democratic coalition, elected Democrats like Joe Manchin from West Virginia and Sinema from Arizona, who are very, very conservative themselves. And they are sabotaging the Democrats' efforts. And the Democrat margin in the Senate is nothing. They're tied in the Senate. So Kamala Harris has to break the votes there, and they've got a slim margin in the House. So Biden has his hands tied by some members of the Democratic Party who don't want to remove the filibuster. And so Biden's domestic policies are, for the most part, positive. I want to give him credit for that, where the credit is due. His foreign policy, to me, is really disappointing. Biden is an old Cold Warrior. Biden was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Biden is a big proponent of NATO. Biden is somebody who has been seeing the world as a bipolar confrontation, this kind of Manichaean worldview in which the United States is the good guys, the free world, the force of democracy, and the Russians and the Chinese are malefactors who are the autocrats, dictators, repressive forces who want to take over the world for their own vision. And that we look at the people who Biden has put in there, very, very disappointing choices. You've got Anthony Blinken as Secretary of State. You got Jake Sullivan as National Security Advisor. You've got Victoria Nuland as number 3 person in the State Department. We've got Kurt Campbell as the Asia Policy Director at the National Security Council. Avril Haines as National Intelligence Director. I mean, these are not the people who I would want to see there. What are they responsible for? They were all supporters of the invasion of Afghanistan. They were all supporters of the invasion of Iraq. They were all supporters of the invasion of Libya. They were all supporters of Timber Sycamore in Syria. They're all supporters of the Asia pivot, which is winding down in the Middle East, not because those forever wars are ridiculous and destructive, but because they want to focus on China now. They want to reorient American policy and American military strategy to China. So and that's what Biden put those people in there. We might say that Bill Burns, as the head of the CIA, is a little bit better. We might say that Wendy Sherman, as the number 2 person in the State Department, is more reasonable. But overall, they've taken this kind of hardline policy. And when we look at the China policy, you've got Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell saying in something they wrote last year, saying that, or actually 2019, that the era of engagement with China has come to an end, that now we've got to confront China militarily. We've got Biden's own words on this trip to Europe now. What does Biden say? He says the U.S. must lead the world from a position of strength. His message over and over again is the U.S. is back. Again, the United States is the leader of the free world, and we're going to rally our allies to stand up to Russia and China. That's the message. It's a confrontational message. It's a military message, and it's the wrong message. And so when Biden is going there for the G7 summit and the US Euro summit and the NATO summit, all in advance of his meeting with Putin, is to rally them to take a strong, unified stance against Russia and China. And not that I'm not critical of Russia and China. I'm not saying that they are angels and the US is the devil. It's a more complicated world than that. However, starting off from this position of antagonism is going to undermine the chances of agreeing on the things that we do agree on, the things that we can work on in common. And if you want an example of how this works in reverse, it's the meeting between Biden and Sullivan and the two Chinese top foreign policy officials in Anchorage. And what happens? Blinken gets there and he starts off by lecturing the Chinese about Hong Kong and about the Uyghurs and about the South China Sea and about Taiwan. And uh, uh, Yang Jiechi, the top Chinese diplomat, responds. So Blinken spoke for 2.5 minutes. Yang Jiechi goes into a 16-minute tirade and says, "Who are you to talk to the Chinese like that?" He says, "You can't talk to us from a position of strength. You can't talk to us from a position of moral authority. You're the ones who invaded Afghanistan. You're the ones who invaded Iraq. You're the ones who created the crisis with Libya and Syria." He goes on and lectures the United States in a way that is unheard of previously. This kind of wolf warrior diplomacy that we've seen coming out of China. And basically, this is something that is unprecedented. This idea that the Chinese and the Russians are no longer dealing from a position of weakness. And we even look, for example, you asked about the G7 meeting. Well, back in the 70s, the G7 represented 80% of GDP globally. Back in 2000, the G7 represented 65% of GDP globally. Now, the G7 represents 40% of GDP globally. The G7 does not include China, does not include India, does not include Russia. And so, there's this inflated sense of what the US and Europe represent globally. But it's no longer the case. And so the Europeans, for example, don't want to play this American game, do not want to be put in the middle in this way. The Europeans want to work with China, they want to work with Russia, and they want to work with the United States. And that's a much more sensible position. So they're not going to be corralled into an anti-Russian or anti-Chinese coalition that the US envisions. So if that's Biden's strategy, it's going to fail. And we saw this recently over the Nord Stream 2. Germany, the US put tremendous pressure on Germany to back out of Nord Stream 2. And Merkel refused to do so. And Macron has refused to go along with the US bullying on these things too. So Western Europe especially is wanting a different kind of relationship with Russia and China than the US is embracing and proposing at this point. Yeah, it's a terrific treaty. It's probably irrelevant in terms of what actually it's going to accomplish. But this goes back several years. a series of meetings internationally, three major conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear war, which then led to proposals in the United Nations for a treaty to ban nuclear weapons. And the treaty was ratified. Well, I mean, a lot of countries, a lot of countries participated in the negotiations and then signed the treaty, but it wouldn't come into effect until it was ratified by 50 countries. And the ratification occurred in January of this year, 2021. The 50th country to ratify was Honduras, very symbolically significant because Honduras was the original banana republic. The United States established United Fruit Company, established there back in the early 20th century. And so the fact that it was Honduras that ratified it, because the United States was vehemently opposed to this treaty. The United States actually put pressure on all of the countries that ratified it and signed it. The United States put pressure on them under Trump, urging them to rescind their ratifications. This was outrageous behavior by the United States. But the problem was that not only the United States, but also all 9 nuclear powers rejected this treaty. They didn't participate in the deliberations, and they're all on record opposing it. Although China has said that it would go along with nuclear powers do. But it's a very important treaty for symbolic reasons, because it represents the will of the world. And the will of the world is that we get rid of nuclear weapons. And it says that not only can you not possess, can you not research, can you not transport, can you not help other countries develop nuclear weapons, even threatening to use nuclear weapons is a crime. And so that's great because, the United States has used nuclear weapons twice in warfare, but the United States has used nuclear weapons repeatedly by threatening to use nuclear weapons if Russia and China and other countries go do things that the United States doesn't like. And so it's a very important treaty, but it is basically an irrelevant treaty because, except for symbolic reasons and heuristic reasons, because none of the nuclear powers are willing to recognize it, and therefore they're not included under the treaty. The problem is that the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has been in effect for more than 50 years now, has been ignored. Certain key provisions have been ignored by all the nuclear powers. Article 6 of the NPT says that the nuclear weapon states, the 5 original nuclear weapon states, can have their nuclear weapons, but they have to begin immediately to get rid of their nuclear weapons, begin immediately working toward that. And we know the reality is that there are more than 13,000 nuclear weapons left in the world today. And the US and Russia have more than 90% of those nuclear weapons between us. And we have more than 1,000 nuclear weapons pointed at each other on hair trigger alert, which means that they would be used immediately in the event of a confrontation. So the danger is, and the world has gotten more dangerous, as we've talked about before, the doomsday clock is set at 100 seconds before midnight. The nuclear doomsday clock was begun in 1947. The closest it's ever been is 100 seconds before midnight, and that's the reality now. Because as people recognize, we're closer to nuclear war now than we've ever been, or at least since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and the crisis in Ukraine, and the crisis in Taiwan. Nobody is crazy enough right now to deliberately initiate a nuclear holocaust, because that is suicidal. If nuclear war begins, the chances of ending life on the planet are very, very, very high. And so nobody would deliberately start that. However, all of these crises could quickly escalate to a nuclear confrontation. what would happen? Okay, the greatest hotspot now, the two are Ukraine and Taiwan. Right now, the Sea of Taiwan, the Straits of Taiwan, are the Americans are running freedom of navigation operations. The Chinese are running massive military operations in the sea, in the air. The very provocative behavior by Trump, continuing under Biden to challenge the one China policy. China has said that effectively that if anything is done to challenge the one China policy, that Taiwan is actually part of China, the Chinese are going to invade. We've run 18 war games in which there's a military confrontation in the Strait of Taiwan. The United States has lost all 18. If there is a military confrontation in the Strait of Taiwan, the Chinese will almost certainly prevail over the US. Taiwan is 100 miles from China. It's 5,000 miles from Honolulu. The Chinese have beefed up their military capabilities. They have the capability to defeat the US in the Strait of Taiwan. What would happen then? What what recourse does the US have? Well, the only recourse really would be nuclear weapons. And the Chinese would the US would suffer tremendous losses in a military confrontation. And the Chinese missiles would land in Guam. The Chinese missiles would land in Okinawa. They'd land in the US bases in Japan. The casualties would be enormous, and the chances of a nuclear war are great in that kind of situation. Ukraine, provocative actions by the US and Zelensky in Ukraine. How did the Russians respond? They put 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border. They put in all the heavy equipment there. People were very afraid that war was imminent in Ukraine, in the Donbass. Uh, Fortunately, they've removed many of those troops and some of that equipment, but that situation is also ready to explode at any point. What is Zelensky saying? He wants Ukraine to become part of NATO. Russia has said that is a red line, that if Ukraine is to become part of NATO, Russia will intervene immediately. Russia will militarily dominate there in Ukraine. There's no doubt about that, that the Russians will defeat the Ukrainians. What is NATO going to do? Ukraine is not part of NATO. So NATO does not have any responsibility to intervene militarily in Ukraine. If NATO does, all bets are off. The chances of these situations escalating into nuclear war are very, very great. And so that's what we're all worried about. And that's why the doomsday clock is so close to midnight. Okay, recently, the U.S. Strategic Command, which is responsible for nuclear weapons and their use, tweeted, the spectrum of conflict today is neither linear nor predictable. We must account for the possibility of conflict leading to conditions which could very rapidly drive adverse nuclear use as their least bad option. There's been more talk about the threat of nuclear war among American military leaders recently than I've seen in many, many years. The head of STRATCOM, the U.S. Strategic Command, Admiral Charles Richard, warned, quote, there is a real possibility that a regional crisis with Russia or China could escalate quickly to a conflict involving nuclear weapons. This is right now, not some fantasy. But now on the positive side of Biden, while he supported the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, when he was vice president, he was the one who opposed the military buildup in Afghanistan. He was the one who resisted it when Obama's generals and Hillary Clinton were pushing for it. Biden also opposed the U.S. NATO operations in Libya. Biden opposed Timber Sycamore, the giving of military lethal aid to the Muslim extremists, Islamic extremists in Syria. So Biden has shown some restraint. Biden did extend the New START treaty as soon as he got into office, which Trump refused to do. Biden has shown some moderation on these things. So when Biden goes there, as long as he is not pressured to do something very dangerously provocative toward 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 Putin, Biden is under tremendous pressure from both Democrats and Republicans to show how tough he is, to stand up toward the Russians on Nord Stream 2 and all these other issues. If Biden is going there to try to humiliate Putin, to show how strong he is, at Putin's express, then we're in a very dangerous position. It's going to be like the aftermath of the Vienna summit in 1961, when after Khrushchev was so bold and hostile toward Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy felt pressure to stand up to Russia afterwards. That led to the July 61 crisis and ultimately to the Cuban Missile Crisis. This could be very, very dangerous also. If this is a failed summit, and then that's not going to be irrelevant. That's going to create a much more dangerous global atmosphere and much worse relation between the US and Russia. So Biden, if he goes into this as a statesman who seems to be a decent person individually, and if he's reasonable and tries to find common ground with Russia over the pandemic, over cyber intrusions, over arms control, over Iran, North Korea, over NATO. If he would say that the U.S. is not going to extend NATO to Ukraine and Georgia, then that's not our policy, then that can make some important headway and ease tensions over Ukraine and maybe lay the basis for even solving that seemingly intractable crisis. So we have grounds to work together. Let's hope that Biden goes there as a statesman and that Putin receives him as a statesman and they begin to work together over the issues that unite us rather than ones that separate us.